The Oklahoma sun beat down mercilessly on the wheat fields outside Tuttle in the summer of 1928. 8-year-old Philip Adair stood barefoot in the dusty yard of his family's modest farm, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The distant rumble of engines caught his attention before he saw them, 3 silver shapes emerging from the haze, growing larger with each passing second. Army Air Corps training planes from nearby Wichita Falls. Young Philip watched, transfixed, as the aircraft swooped low over the farmland, their engines roaring like thunder. The horses in the nearby pasture scattered in panic, their hooves pounding the hard earth as they fled from the mechanical birds invading their world. His father shouted something from the barn, probably cursing those reckless pilots, but Philip couldn't hear him over the roar of the engines. In that moment, standing in the dust and heat of an Oklahoma summer, something crystallized in the young boy's mind. He didn't just want to watch airplanes, he wanted to fly them. This is the story of how that farm boy would grow up to face impossible odds in the skies over India, using flying techniques so unconventional that they defied every rule in the pilot's manual. It's a story of split-second decisions, desperate innovation, and a battle that should have ended in certain death. But on December 13, 1943, Second Lieutenant Philip Reed Adair would prove that sometimes the impossible is just another word for what hasn't been tried yet. The years between that summer day and Pearl Harbor moved quickly for young Philip Adair. The Great Depression hit Oklahoma hard, turning fertile farmland into dust bowls and dreams into distant memories. But Adair never forgot those silver planes dancing across the sky. After graduating from high school in 1937, the harsh reality of the Depression confronted him immediately. College was a luxury his family couldn't afford. The farm provided food, but little cash, and the nation was still clawing its way out of economic despair. Most of his classmates took whatever work they could find, factory jobs or farm labor, anything to put food on the table. But Adair had a different plan. He took a job as a candy salesman, traveling the dusty roads of Oklahoma with cases of chocolates and hard candies, trying to convince store owners to part with precious dollars for luxury items in the midst of hard times. The work was grueling, the pay modest, but Adair had a purpose. Every dollar he saved went into a special fund hidden away in a coffee can beneath his bed. Flying lesson. On weekends and any spare moment he could find, Adair made his way to the local airfield. The instructors there saw dozens of farm boys with dreams of flying, most of whom washed out after a lesson or two when they realized how difficult it actually was. But Adair was different. He had patience honed by years of farm work where you couldn't rush the seasons or force the wheat to grow faster. He understood that mastery took time. The instructors also noticed something else. Adair had an instinctive understanding of three-dimensional space, a rare gift that couldn't be taught. Growing up driving tractors and farm equipment across uneven terrain, navigating between fields and obstacles, had trained his mind to think spatially. In the air, this translated into an uncanny ability to judge distances and relative positions. By late 1941, Adair had his pilot's license. He was ready. The world, however, was about to change in ways no one could have predicted. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The news crackled over radios across America, bringing the distant war in Europe and Asia crashing into living rooms from coast to coast. Young men lined up at recruitment offices, driven by patriotism, anger, and the desire to serve. Philip Adair was among them. The Army Air Corps accepted him immediately. His pilot's license and flight experience made him a valuable commodity in a nation suddenly desperate for trained aviators. The military could teach young men to march and shoot, but teaching someone to fly from scratch took time, and time was a luxury America didn't have. Adair shipped out to Lukefield, Arizona for advanced training. The desert heat reminded him of Oklahoma summers, but everything else was different. The training was intense, demanding, and occasionally dangerous. Student pilots died with sobering regularity, their names added to growing lists of casualties even before they saw combat. But Adair excelled. His instructors noted his calm demeanor under pressure and his ability to make quick decisions in critical situations. He graduated with his commission as a second lieutenant in 1942, then moved to Mitchell Field, New York, where he transitioned to fighters, the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. To Adair, the P-40 was beautiful in a brutal utilitarian way. It wasn't the fastest plane in the sky, nor the most maneuverable, but it was tough, reliable, and deadly in the right hands. The shark-mouth paint scheme on its nose gave it a fierce appearance, and the sound of its Allison engine became music to his ears. In the spring of 1943, Adair received his assignment, the 80th Fighter Group, 89th Fighter Squadron. Their destination was classified, but rumors spread quickly among the pilots. They were heading east, to the China-Burma-India theater. The war in that distant corner of the world was different from the European conflict. The battles happened over vast stretches of jungle and mountain, where a downed pilot might never be found. The Japanese controlled much of Burma and threatened the vital supply line known as the Hump, the treacherous air route over the Himalayas that kept China supplied and in the war. The 80th Fighter Group would become known as the Burma Banshees, flying P-40s adorned with a distinctive white skull painted on their noses. Their mission was to protect the transport aircraft flying the Hump and to strike at Japanese positions throughout Burma and northern India. For Philip Adair, it was exactly where he wanted to be, in the skies, far from the Oklahoma wheat fields, doing what he'd dreamed about since he was 8 years old. By October of 1943, Adair was stationed at Nagaguli, in eastern India's Assam Valley. The base was primitive by any standard, carved out of jungle with metal Quonset huts for shelter and a dirt runway that turned to mud in the monsoon rains. The heat was oppressive, the mosquitoes relentless, and disease a constant threat. But for fighter pilots like Adair, these discomforts were background noise. They lived for their time in the air, for the moments of pure focus when nothing existed except them, their plane, and the enemy. Adair had named his P-40 Lulu Bell, painting the name on the fuselage with care. The plane wasn't just a machine to him. It was a partner, a trusted companion that he maintained with the same dedication he'd once applied to farm equipment back home. He even went so far as to install wide white-wall tires on Lulu Bell, a touch of automotive styling that made his fighter distinctive and drew amused comments from other pilots. It was aircraft number 44 in the squadron, a detail that would become significant. The Burma Banshees flew constant patrols, protecting the transport planes that carried desperately needed supplies over the Hump. The Japanese were aggressive and skilled, their fighters often appearing without warning to strike at the vulnerable transport aircraft. Every mission carried the risk of combat, and every pilot knew that the odds would catch up with them eventually. The question wasn't if they would face the enemy, but when. For Philip Adair, that moment came on December 13, 1943, his 44th mission. The morning of December 13th began like any other at Nagaguli. Adair woke before dawn, the air still cool before the brutal heat of the day set in. He went through his pre-flight routine with practiced efficiency, checking Lulu Bell's systems, walking around the aircraft to inspect for any damage or mechanical issues. Everything looked good. The white skull on the nose seemed to grin at him in the growing light. The mission briefing was routine. Patrol the area around Dinjan Airfield, one of the major bases for the Hump operation. Intelligence suggested increased Japanese air activity, but that was always the case. The enemy was persistent, probing for weaknesses, looking for opportunities to strike at the vulnerable transport planes. Adair climbed into Lulu Bell's cockpit, settling into the seat that had molded to his body over dozens of missions. The instrument panel was as familiar to him as the dashboard of his father's old Ford had been. He went through the startup sequence, feeling the rumble of the Allison engine coming to life, the vibration running through the air frame and into his bones. It felt right. It felt ready. Lulu Bell rolled down the dirt runway, picking up speed, and then they were airborne, climbing into the clear morning sky. Below, the jungle stretched endlessly, a carpet of green, broken only by rivers and occasional clearings. Adair climbed to altitude, leveling off and beginning his patrol pattern. The radio crackled with routine communications, other pilots checking in, reporting their positions, confirming all clear. The morning was peaceful, almost serene, the kind of morning that made you forget there was a war on. That peace wouldn't last long. Adair had been on patrol for about an hour when he first noticed them. At first, he thought it was just another flight of friendlies, maybe 4 aircraft in the distance. But something about their formation made him take a closer look. His blood went cold. They weren't 4 planes, they were dozens, and they were Japanese. Adair's eyes tracked across the sky, counting 24 twin-engine bombers, Mitsubishi Ki-21s that the Allies called Sally, flying in tight formation. Their target was obvious: the Dinjan airfield, one of the most important bases for the hump operation. And surrounding those bombers like angry hornets were their escorts, Nakajima Ki-43 fighters, known to the Allies as Oscar. Adair counted them quickly, his mind racing. 35, maybe 40 fighters, weaving above and around the bomber formation, 64 enemy aircraft all told, maybe more, and he was alone. The rational part of Adair's mind screamed at him to break off, to head back to base and call in reinforcements. One P-40 against 64 enemy aircraft wasn't a fight. It was a death sentence. Every rule of engagement, every tactical doctrine, every bit of common sense said to run. But if he ran, those bombers would reach Dinjan unopposed. They would destroy aircraft on the ground, wreck facilities, devastate the personnel and equipment that kept the hump operation running. Transport crews would perish. The supply line to China would be disrupted. Men fighting elsewhere would run out of ammunition, medicine, food. Philip Adair, the farm boy from Oklahoma, who had dreamed of flying since he was 8 years old, faced the defining decision of his life. He pushed the throttle forward and dove toward the enemy formation. The key to survival, Adair knew, was surprise. The Japanese hadn't seen him yet. He was above them, coming out of the sun, a single speck against the glare. If he could hit them hard and fast, create chaos in their formation, he might disrupt their bombing run long enough for help to arrive. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only plan he had. Adair selected his target carefully, the lead bomber in the formation. If he could take out the leader, the others might break formation, making them easier targets for the anti-aircraft guns at Dinjan. He armed his weapons, 6 .50 caliber machine guns mounted in Lulu Bell's wings, each one loaded with hundreds of rounds of ammunition. It would have to be enough. He came in from above and to the left, diving at maximum speed. The wind screamed past Lulu Bell's canopy, the airframe shuddering with the strain. Adair's eyes were locked on the lead bomber, his hands steady on the controls despite his racing heart. 3,000 yards, 2,000, 1,500. At maximum range, he opened fire. The 6 machine guns roared to life, tracers arcing across the sky like angry fireflies. Adair wasn't trying to destroy the bombers at this range. He was trying to shake them up, to let them know they were under attack, to create confusion and fear. It worked. The bomber formation suddenly began to waver, individual aircraft bouncing up and down as their pilots reacted to the incoming fire. The tight formation they'd maintained started to loosen, gaps appearing between aircraft. But now the escort fighters had seen him. Adair's attack had been like kicking a hornet's nest. Suddenly, there were Japanese fighters everywhere, breaking off from the bomber formation and turning toward him. The Oscars were nimble and deadly, more maneuverable than his P-40, and there were dozens of them. He was about to enter a fight that no pilot could win. The first rule of fighter combat is simple: maintain your energy. Speed is life. Height is life insurance. A pilot who lets himself get slow and low is a dead pilot. Adair had started with the advantage of altitude and surprise. Now he had to use that energy wisely. He continued his dive, racing past the bomber formation at over 300 miles per hour, the enemy aircraft flashing by in a blur. Behind him, the Oscars were turning to pursue, but Adair's diving speed gave him a crucial few seconds of breathing room. He leveled off below the bomber formation, then pulled back on the stick, climbing hard to regain altitude. This was where the P-40 excelled. In a dive or a zoom climb, the heavier American fighter could outperform the nimble Oscar. The Japanese fighters were faster in a turn, but Adair wasn't turning. He was extending, using his speed to create separation. As he climbed, Adair craned his neck, keeping visual contact with the enemy formation. The bombers had scattered somewhat, their tight formation disrupted by his attack. Good. That would make them easier targets for the ground defenses. But the escorts were coming for him now, and they were angry. A group of 4 Oscars had peeled off from the main formation and were climbing toward him. Adair could see them clearly, their distinctive profile unmistakable. The Japanese fighters were painted in mottled green and brown camouflage, and they were closing fast. Adair leveled off, checking his airspeed and altitude. He had about 1,000-foot advantage over the pursuing fighters, and he was still moving fast. Good. He would need every bit of that energy for what came next. The lead Oscar opened fire, tracers arcing toward Lulu Bell. The rounds passed well behind. The Japanese pilot misjudging Adair's speed, but more fighters were joining the chase now, and it was only a matter of time before someone got lucky. Adair made his decision. Instead of running, he pulled Lulu Bell into a steep turn, reversing his direction and heading back toward the bomber formation. The move was aggressive, almost reckless, but it caught the Japanese pilots off guard. He was going back into the hornet's nest. The bomber formation was below him now, the pilot still trying to reorganize after his first attack. Adair picked his target, a Sally bomber that had strayed from the main group, vulnerable and alone. He rolled Lulu Bell into a diving attack, his guns already tracking the bomber. The P-40's 650s roared again, sending a stream of half-inch bullets tearing toward the enemy aircraft. Hits. Adair could see the flashes as his rounds struck the bomber's engine and fuselage. Smoke began to trail from the Sally's right engine, then flames. The bomber staggered in the air, its pilot fighting for control, but Adair couldn't stay to watch the result. The escort fighters were all over him now, at least a dozen Oscars converging on his position. He was in the middle of a furious dogfight, outnumbered more than 10 to 1. Tracers filled the air around Lulu Bell, some passing so close that Adair could hear them over the roar of his engine. The Japanese pilots were good, experienced, and they were coordinating their attacks with deadly efficiency. Adair threw the P-40 into a series of violent maneuvers, jinking left and right, climbing and diving, never staying in one place long enough for the enemy pilots to get a clean shot. The G-forces slammed him back and forth in his seat, his vision graying at the edges as the blood drained from his head during hard turns. He spotted another target, an Oscar that had overshot in its eagerness to get him. Adair pulled hard on the stick, bringing his nose around and fired a burst. The Oscar staggered, hit, and began trailing smoke. Probably a victory, but again, no time to confirm. More fighters were coming. They seemed endless. Adair's mind raced through his options. He couldn't outmaneuver them all. The P-40 was a good fighter, but not good enough to take on a dozen Oscars in a turning fight. He needed to change the game somehow, to use tactics they wouldn't expect, and then an Oscar got through his defenses. Adair felt the impacts before he heard them, a series of hammering blows that shook Lulu Bell violently. The Oscar had gotten a perfect deflection shot, its machine gun stitching a line across the P-40's nose and engine cowling. Instantly, smoke began pouring from the engine, not the black smoke of an oil fire, but white smoke, coolant. The Oscar's bullets had punctured Lulu Bell's cooling system. For a pilot, there are few things more terrifying than a failing engine. Without coolant, the engine would overheat rapidly, seizing up in a matter of minutes, maybe less. And a dead engine meant a dead plane. And out here, over hostile territory, with the nearest friendly base dozens of miles away, that meant a dead pilot. Adair's eyes flicked to his instruments. Engine temperature was already climbing, the needle creeping into the red zone. Oil pressure was fluctuating. The engine was running rough, missing on at least one cylinder. He had to get out of the fight. Now. Adair pushed the stick forward into the left corner, executing a -G outside roll, a maneuver that few pilots would attempt in combat because it was disorienting and potentially dangerous, but it worked. He dove away from the swirling dogfight, accelerating toward the jungle below. The Oscars tried to follow, but Adair's desperate dive had built up too much speed. He pulled out at low altitude, racing just above the treetops, and the Japanese fighters broke off, returning to escort the bombers. For the moment, he was alone, but his troubles were just beginning. Lulu Bell was dying. Adair could feel it in the way the engine was running, the increasing vibration, the steady rise in temperature. White smoke continued to pour from the cowling, streaming past the canopy like fog. The engine coughed, sputtered, and then caught again. It was trying to keep running, but it was a losing battle. Without coolant, the metal parts were grinding together, friction creating heat, heat causing expansion, expansion leading to seizing. Adair's mind raced through his options. He was maybe 20 miles from Nagaguli, his home base, too far to glide, even if he climbed to altitude first, and climbing with a failing engine might cause it to seize completely. He could bail out, but that meant parachuting into Japanese-controlled territory. At best, he'd spend the rest of the war in a prisoner camp. At worst, well, The stories about what happened to Allied pilots captured by the Japanese were not encouraging. No, he had to try to make it home, even if the odds were impossible. The engine coughed again, running rough. Adair eased back on the throttle, trying to reduce the load to keep it running just a little longer. But as soon as he reduced power, the engine started to sputter more. It needed power to keep running, but power was generating the heat that was destroying it. A terrible catch-22, and then the engine quit completely. The sudden silence was deafening. After the constant roar of the Allison engine, its absence felt like a physical blow. Lulu Bell was now a glider with all the flying characteristics of a brick. Adair's eyes scanned the instrument panel, looking for any indication of what might help. Airspeed was dropping. Altitude was dropping. The jungle below was getting closer with every second. His training screamed at him to bail out. Every instinct said to pop the canopy, roll the plane inverted, and drop away before it was too late. But something made him hesitate. Some stubborn Oklahoma farm boy instinct that said, you don't give up on your equipment just because things get hard. And then, in a moment of desperate inspiration, he had an idea. It was crazy, potentially suicidal. It violated every rule in the pilot's manual, but it was the only thing he could think of. Adair reached for the stick and pulled it all the way back. Lulu Bell's nose came up, the plane climbing despite the dead engine, trading what little speed she had left for altitude. The stall warning indicator started buzzing, telling him he was about to fall out of the sky. And then, just as the plane was about to stall completely, Adair pushed the stick forward, rolling Lulu Bell inverted. Upside down, flying on her back, something impossible happened. The engine caught and roared back to life. Adair hung in his harness, held in place by his shoulder straps, the jungle now above him and the sky below. The G-forces were pulling blood to his head, making his vision red at the edges. But the engine was running. The temperature gauge was still in the red, but the engine was running. He realized what had happened. With the cooling system damaged, coolant was pooling in the bottom of the engine block, unable to circulate properly. But when he flipped the plane upside down, gravity pulled that coolant into different parts of the engine, cooling the cylinders that had been running hot. It was impossible. It shouldn't work, but it was working. Adair held the inverted position as long as he dared, watching the engine temperature gauge slowly creep back from the red zone. The white smoke trailing from the cowling began to thin, not gone, but less. The engine was cooling, if only temporarily, but he couldn't fly upside down forever. His neck was straining from the unusual position, and he was getting dizzy from the inverted flight. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds, he rolled Lulu Bell back upright. Instantly, the engine began to overheat again. The temperature gauge climbed rapidly back toward the red zone. Smoke poured from the cowling, so Adair rolled inverted again. It became a desperate rhythm. 30 seconds inverted, letting gravity feed coolant to the hot parts of the engine. 30 seconds upright, flying toward home while the engine overheated again. Roll inverted, roll upright, over and over, like some insane aerial ballet. Adair lost count of how many times he flipped Lulu Bell over. His world reduced to simple priorities. Watch the temperature gauge, feel the engine. When it gets too hot, roll inverted. When you can't stay inverted any longer, roll upright. Keep the nose pointed toward home. Don't think about what happens if the engine ceases completely while you're inverted. The jungle passed below, then above, then below again. Rivers and clearings flashed by, meaningless geography in his desperate flight home. Other pilots would have considered him insane. The manual said nothing about flying inverted to cool your engine because no one had ever considered that anyone would try something so ridiculous. But Philip Adair wasn't thinking about manuals or doctrine. He was thinking like a farm boy who knew that sometimes you had to improvise to use whatever tools you had in whatever way worked, no matter how unconventional. His father had taught him that back on the Oklahoma farm. When the tractor broke down in the middle of planting season, you didn't wait for a proper repair. You fixed it with baling wire and ingenuity and kept going. The wheat didn't care if your fix was elegant. It only cared if it worked. The same principle applied here. 3,000 miles from Oklahoma and 8,000 feet above the Burmese jungle. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, Adair spotted the familiar landmarks that meant he was close to Nagaguli, the river bend that had marked the approach, the clearing where they'd had to crash land a damaged B-25 last month, the radio tower that marked the field boundary boundary, home. But now came the hardest part. He had to land. Landing a plane with a failing engine is difficult enough. Landing a plane while flying it upside down half the time is exponentially harder. Adair would have to time it perfectly, rolling upright at just the right moment, using whatever power the dying engine could provide for one final approach. He rolled upright, feeling the engine immediately start to roughen as it overheated again. But he was close now, just had to make it a little farther. The runway was visible ahead, a strip of cleared dirt that looked impossibly short from his current altitude. Adair began his approach, fighting to keep the sputtering engine running. The P-40 wanted to drop like a stone without full power, and he had to use every bit of his skill to maintain a decent glide slope. On the ground, the other pilots had seen him coming. Word had spread about the lone P-40 that had engaged 64 Japanese aircraft, and everyone knew that plane number 44 was Lulu Bell, was Philip Adair. They watched as the damaged fighter approached, trailing smoke, wobbling in the air like a wounded bird. Some thought he wouldn't make it, that he'd have to bail out at the last second or crash short of the runway. But Adair had come too far, survived too much to fail now. 200 feet. 150. The engine gave one final cough and quit completely, but Adair had timed it perfectly. Lulu Bell glided over the runway threshold, her white-rimmed wheels kissing the dirt with barely a bump. The plane rolled to a stop, smoke still pouring from the cowling, but intact. Adair sat in the cockpit for a moment, his hands shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion. Through the smoke, he could see ground crew running toward him with fire extinguishers. Other pilots were sprinting from the ready tent, shouting questions. Slowly, carefully, Philip Adair unbuckled his harness and climbed down from Lulu Bell's cockpit. His legs were unsteady, and someone had to catch his arm to keep him from falling. But he was alive. Against all odds, impossible odds, he was alive. The debriefing after the mission was chaotic. Intelligence officers wanted every detail. How many Japanese aircraft? What types? Where exactly had the engagement occurred? What was the result? Adair answered as best he could, his voice hoarse from shouting over the engine noise during the flight home. He confirmed 2 enemy aircraft destroyed, 1 bomber and 1 fighter, probably 2 or 3 more damaged. The bomber formation had been scattered, forced to drop their bombs early or abandon their attack entirely. The mission to Dinjan had been disrupted, but the intelligence officers seemed less interested in those results than in how Adair had survived. When he described flying inverted to cool his engine, there was stunned silence in the debriefing room. Someone asked him to repeat it, to make sure they'd heard correctly. Yes, Adair confirmed. He'd flown upside down multiple times. It was the only way to keep the engine running long enough to make it home. The senior officer present, a major who'd been flying since before the war, just shook his head in amazement. In 30 years of aviation, he'd never heard of anything like it. It shouldn't have worked. By all the laws of physics and engineering, it shouldn't have worked, but it had worked. And Philip Adair was sitting in front of them, tired but alive, proof that sometimes the impossible was just another word for what hadn't been tried yet. Word of Adair's mission spread quickly through the base, then through the theater, then throughout the entire Army Air Forces. The lone pilot who had engaged 64 Japanese aircraft and survived. The man who had flown his damaged plane home upside down. His squadron mates started calling him Flip Adair, a nickname he bore with good-natured embarrassment. The ground crew chief who examined Lulu Bell after the mission declared the plane would need extensive repairs. The engine was essentially destroyed, the cooling system shot to pieces, but the airframe was intact, salvageable. Within a few weeks, Lulu Bell would be back in the air with a new engine and repaired systems, ready to fly again. For his actions on December 13th, Philip Adair was awarded the Silver Star, one of the nation's highest decorations for valor in combat. The citation read in part, for gallantry in action against an armed enemy. Second Lieutenant Adair, upon encountering a vastly superior enemy force, unhesitatingly pressed home his attack, disrupting the enemy formation and preventing a successful bombing of friendly installations. His courage and devotion to duty reflect the highest credit upon himself and the Army Air Forces. But the medal wasn't what mattered to Adair. What mattered was that he'd done his job. He'd protected the bombers at Dinjan. He'd brought his plane home. He'd lived to fly another day. Philip Adair would go on to fly 95 more combat missions before the end of his tour. He became an ace, officially credited with 5 enemy aircraft destroyed. But he always maintained that his 44th mission, that December day when he'd faced impossible odds alone, was the most important of his career. Not because of the tactical results, though those were significant. Not because of the medal, though he wore it with quiet pride. But because it taught him something fundamental about himself and about flying. The rule books and training manuals were important. They provided the foundation, the basic skills that kept you alive. But in combat, in the moment of crisis, when death was seconds away, sometimes you had to throw out the rule book and trust your instincts. You had to be willing to try the impossible, to attempt the maneuver that every instructor said couldn't be done. Because sometimes, just sometimes, the impossible worked. After the war, Adair continued his military career, eventually retiring as a full colonel after 30 years of service. He'd flown in Korea as well, adding to his impressive combat record. But whenever people asked him about his service, whenever historians or aviation enthusiasts sought him out, the conversation always came back to that day in December 1943, the day the farm boy from Oklahoma fought 64 Japanese aircraft and won. Adair lived a long life, passing away in 2017 at the age of 97. He was buried with full military honors at Quantico National Cemetery, a fitting resting place for a warrior who had served his nation with distinction for 3 decades. But long before his passing, he'd achieved a kind of immortality. His story became part of the legends of World War II aviation, told and retold in countless books and articles. The tactics he'd pioneered, that desperate inverted flying to cool a failing engine, were studied by engineers and pilots, analyzed and documented. Some said it couldn't have worked, that the physics didn't support it. Others ran the calculations and realized that under the exact conditions Adair had faced, it was theoretically possible. Unlikely, but possible. Adair himself never much cared about the debates. He knew what had happened. He'd lived it. The equations and theories were for people who hadn't been there, hanging upside down in a damaged fighter over the Burmese jungle, watching their engine temperature gauge and praying for just a few more minutes of flight time. The legacy of Philip Adair's impossible flight extends beyond just the historical record. It became a teaching moment for generations of military aviators. A lesson in improvisation, in thinking outside the conventional frameworks, in refusing to accept defeat even when the odds are overwhelmingly against you. Fighter pilots are, by nature, confident and aggressive. They have to be. You can't succeed in air combat if you're hesitant or uncertain, but there's a fine line between confidence and recklessness, between bold action and foolish bravado. Adair's story illustrated where that line was. He didn't attack 64 Japanese aircraft because he thought he could shoot them all down. He attacked because he understood the larger mission, the strategic importance of protecting Dinjan Airfield. He accepted enormous personal risk in service of a goal that transcended his own survival. That's not recklessness, that's heroism. And when his plane was damaged, when the easy choice would have been to bail out and save himself, Adair chose instead to try to bring Lulu Bell home, not out of some romantic attachment to his aircraft, but because a P-40 fighter was a valuable asset that could be repaired and flown again. Losing the plane meant losing firepower that the squadron needed. These calculations happened in seconds, instinctive decisions made under enormous stress, but they were the right decisions, both tactically and strategically. Adair's training had prepared him for the mechanics of flying and fighting, but his character, forged on an Oklahoma farm and tempered by the hardships of the Depression, gave him the moral foundation to make those decisions correctly. Today, more than 80 years after that December morning over Assam, the story of Philip Adair and Lulu Bell continues to resonate. Aviation museums display replicas of his distinctive P-40 with its white skull nose art and unusual white-wall tires. Historians cite his combat record as an example of individual initiative in warfare. And pilots, both military and civilian, study his tactics as an example of how to think creatively in crisis situations. But perhaps the most important lesson of Adair's story isn't about flying at all. It's about facing impossible odds with determination and courage. It's about refusing to give up when every rational calculation says you should. It's about the power of human ingenuity to overcome technological limitations. These lessons apply far beyond the cockpit of a World War II fighter. They apply to anyone facing seemingly insurmountable challenges: the business leader trying to save a failing company, the student struggling with a difficult course, the athlete coming back from a career-threatening injury, the parent dealing with an impossible situation. In each case, the conventional wisdom might say the situation is hopeless. The odds are too long. The challenge is too great. Better to accept defeat gracefully than to exhaust yourself fighting a losing battle. But Adair's story says something different. It says that sometimes, just sometimes, if you're willing to try the unconventional approach, if you're willing to flip everything upside down and see if that works, you might just find a way through. The Burma Banshees of the 80th Fighter Group flew throughout the war, compiling an impressive combat record. They shot down hundreds of Japanese aircraft, destroyed countless enemy installations, and supported ground forces across Burma and China. The white skulls on their P-40s became a feared symbol among Japanese pilots. But of all the missions flown by the Burma Banshees, of all the battles fought and victories achieved, few stories resonate as powerfully as that of Philip Adair's 44th mission. One pilot, one plane, 64 enemy aircraft, and an impossible flight pattern that defied every rule in the manual. It's the kind of story that seems too incredible to be true, the kind that would be dismissed as Hollywood exaggeration if it hadn't been meticulously documented by military records and eyewitness accounts. The intelligence reports from that day confirm the numbers. The maintenance logs confirm the damage to Lulu Bell. The citation for Adair's Silver Star confirms the events. It really happened, all of it. In the decades since World War II, aviation technology has advanced beyond anything Philip Adair could have imagined. Modern fighter jets fly at supersonic speeds, guided by computers and armed with missiles that can hit targets miles away. The era of dogfighting, of visual range air combat, seems almost quaint in comparison. But the fundamental challenges of air combat remain unchanged. A pilot still has to make split-second decisions under enormous stress. They still have to manage fear and adrenaline while maintaining tactical awareness. They still have to be willing to press the attack even when outnumbered. And occasionally, they still have to try the impossible. Modern pilots who learn about Adair's story often express amazement, not just at what he did, but at how he thought through the problem, the systematic way he analyzed his situation, identified his options, and chose the course of action most likely to achieve his objective, all while flying a damaged aircraft through hostile territory with enemy fighters potentially in pursuit. That kind of coolness under pressure, that ability to think clearly in crisis, is what separates exceptional pilots from merely good ones. It can't be taught in a classroom or trained in a simulator. It comes from somewhere deeper, from a wellspring of character and determination. Philip Adair had it. He'd developed it over years of hard work, first on the Oklahoma farm, then as a candy salesman struggling through the Depression, then through the demanding training pipeline of the Army Air Corps. By the time he climbed into Lulu Bell's cockpit that December morning, he was ready for whatever challenges came his way, even if those challenges seemed impossible. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk was never the most glamorous fighter of World War II. It lacked the speed of the P-51 Mustang, the high-altitude performance of the P-47 Thunderbolt, or the twin-engine power of the P-38 Lightning. By late 1943, when Adair was flying his combat missions, the P-40 was already being phased out of service in many theaters, replaced by more advanced aircraft. But in the hands of a skilled pilot like Adair, the P-40 was still a formidable weapon. Its robust construction made it difficult to bring down. Its 650 caliber machine guns provided devastating firepower, and its reliability meant that pilots could trust it to bring them home, even when damaged. Lulu Bell exemplified these qualities. Despite taking hits from Japanese machine guns, despite losing her cooling system, despite operating in conditions that should have caused catastrophic engine failure, she kept flying. When Adair asked her to fly inverted, something no engineer had ever designed her to do, she responded, "There's a partnership between pilot and aircraft that's difficult to explain to someone who's never flown. The plane becomes an extension of the pilot's body, responding to inputs with an immediacy that feels almost telepathic. The best pilots develop an intuitive sense of what their aircraft can do, pushing right right up to the edge of the flight envelope without crossing into disaster. Adair had that sense. He knew what Lulu Bell was capable of, even in extremis. He trusted her, and she didn't let him down. In the years following the war, as the full scope of World War II's air campaigns became clear, military historians began to analyze which tactics had been most effective. They studied the great aces, trying to determine what made them successful. They examined squadron-level operations, looking for patterns that could inform future doctrine. What they found was that success in air combat came down to several key factors: situational awareness, the ability to track multiple aircraft simultaneously and understand the developing tactical situation, energy management, using speed and altitude to maintain an advantage over opponents, marksmanship, the skill to actually hit a moving target from a moving platform, and perhaps most importantly, decision-making under pressure. Adair's December 13th mission illustrated all of these factors. His decision to attack the bomber formation showed situational awareness. He recognized the strategic importance of disrupting the attack, even at great personal risk. His use of diving attacks to maintain energy advantage showed tactical acumen. His confirmed victories demonstrated marksmanship, and his entire flight home with the inverted flying technique was a masterclass in crisis decision-making. But there was something else too, something that transcended the tactical lessons. There was courage. Not the reckless, foolhardy kind that gets people needlessly terminated, but the rational, calculated kind that accurately assesses risk and chooses to proceed anyway when the mission demands it. That's the kind of courage that wins wars. The 10th Air Force, of which the Burma Banshees were a part, faced unique challenges throughout the war. Operating in a remote theater, far from the publicity and resources devoted to the campaigns in Europe and the Pacific, they fought what was sometimes called the Forgotten War. Supplies were scarce, living conditions were primitive, and recognition was limited. But the work they did was vital. The Hump airlift kept China in the war, providing nationalist forces with the weapons and supplies needed to tie down Japanese armies that might otherwise have been deployed elsewhere. Every transport plane that made it across the Himalayas contributed to that strategic goal, and every fighter mission that protected those transports was a brick in the wall of Allied victory. Philip Adair and his squadron mates understood this. They might not have gotten the headlines or the newsreel coverage of pilots in other theaters, but they knew their work mattered. They flew their missions with professionalism and dedication, asking only for the tools to do their jobs and the chance to make a difference. On December 13, 1943, Philip Adair made a difference. The bombers he scattered never reached Dinjan. The supplies stored there remained intact. The transports continued flying. The Hump remained open, and China stayed in the war. Multiply that impact across hundreds of similar missions, flown by dozens of pilots over months and years, and you begin to understand the strategic significance of what the Burma Banshees accomplished. They were part of something larger than themselves, a vast military machine working toward victory, and each of them, in their own way, contributed to that ultimate goal. In 2017, when Philip Adair passed away at the age of 97, the obituaries in military publications and aviation magazines recounted his remarkable career. They mentioned his 30 years of service, his combat missions in 2 wars, his decorations and awards, but inevitably they all came back to that December day in 1943, the day he fought 64 Japanese aircraft, the day he flew home upside down, the day he proved that sometimes the impossible is just another problem waiting for the right solution. His family gathered for his funeral, heard the stories from fellow veterans who had traveled from across the country to pay their respects. They heard about Lulu Bell and the white skull nose art. They heard about the white wall tires and the distinctive paint scheme. They heard about the inverted flying technique that had become legend. But what they remembered most was the man himself, the farm boy from Oklahoma, who had never lost his fundamental decency and humility, who had faced extraordinary challenges with quiet determination, who had served his country not for glory or recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. That was Philip Adair's true legacy, not the medals or the combat record, important as those were, but the example he set of how to live a life of service and honor, how to face the impossible with courage, how to never give up even when all rational calculation says you should. Today, the story of Philip Adair and his impossible flight continues to inspire new generations. Aviation enthusiasts build detailed models of Lulu Bell, meticulously recreating every detail of her distinctive appearance. Video game developers include the December 13th mission as a playable scenario in combat flight simulators, and military academies use the story as a case study in tactical decision-making under pressure. But perhaps the most fitting memorial to Adair's legacy is the countless pilots, both military and civilian, who have faced their own impossible situations and remembered his example. The pilot who successfully landed a crippled airliner, saving hundreds of lives. The combat aviator who brought his damaged fighter home through skill and determination. The flight instructor who talked a panicked student through a crisis. In each case, they drew on the same wellspring of courage and ingenuity that Adair demonstrated that day over Assam. They refused to accept the impossible. They trusted their training, their aircraft, and themselves. They tried the unconventional approach, and they succeeded. That's the power of a true hero's story. It doesn't just entertain or inform, it transforms. It shows us what's possible when we refuse to give up, when we're willing to think creatively, when we have the courage to attempt what others say can't be done. The skies over Assam are quiet now. The air bases that once bustled with activity have long since been abandoned or converted to civilian use. The jungle has reclaimed much of what the war temporarily cleared. The sound of P-40 engines no longer echoes over the valleys and rivers, but the memory remains. The memory of young men far from home fighting a desperate war in a forgotten theater. The memory of aircraft painted with fierce insignia, bearing names like Lulu Bell, carrying pilots like Philip Adair into combat day after day. The memory of impossible odds faced with unshakable determination. On December 13, 1943, a farm boy from Oklahoma climbed into his fighter plane and flew into legend. He engaged 64 enemy aircraft single-handedly. He disrupted their attack. He survived hits that should have brought him down. He flew home using a technique that defied all conventional wisdom, and he landed safely, bringing his damaged aircraft back to fight another day. It's a story that deserves to be remembered, not just as a remarkable feat of flying, though it certainly was that, but as a lesson in human capability, in the power of determination to overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. Because Philip Adair proved something important that day. He proved that the impossible is often just another word for what we haven't figured out yet. That with courage, ingenuity, and determination, we can find solutions to problems that seem to have no solutions. That the rulebook is a starting point, not a limitation. And that sometimes, just sometimes, if you're willing to flip everything upside down and see if it works, you might just find your way home. That's the legacy of the farm boy who outsmarted 40 Japanese fighters. That's the lesson of Lulu Bell and her impossible flight pattern. That's the story worth telling 80 years later to anyone who faces their own impossible challenges. Never give up. Trust your training. Think creatively. And when all else fails, try flying upside down. It might just work.